What if the silence you keep avoiding is the very place where your strength begins? We live in a world that moves too fast, speaks too loud, and celebrates being constantly seen. Yet the truth is, your greatest transformation won't happen in the crowd. It happens in solitude. And not the kind that feels like punishment, but the kind that sharpens, reveals, and rebuilds. This isn't a philosophy to admire from a distance. This is your invitation to walk your path alone and not feel lost doing it. Too often, we chase approval, validation, and noise, believing we're making progress. But real progress doesn't shout. It whispers. It happens when no one's watching. When it's just you, your breath, and the thoughts you've been avoiding for years, that's where clarity is forged. That's where the Stoic mind is built. Not in applause, but in the silent decision to keep going anyway. In this video, we'll explore the quiet power of walking your own path, how to find clarity through solitude, why strength is born in silence, and what it truly means to reclaim yourself from the world's expectations. You are not behind. You are exactly where you need to be to begin. So pause, breathe, let this be your sanctuary. And if it resonates, share your thoughts below and subscribe to join a space where your presence matters, even in silence. This journey isn't for everyone, but maybe it's been waiting for you. One, solitude is not loneliness. It's where you meet your real self. Solitude is not the absence of connection. It's the space where real connection begins, not with others, with yourself. We confuse loneliness with emptiness, but solitude is present. It is full, it is awake. It's the quiet room where all your distractions fall away, and you finally meet the one person you've been running from, yourself. Most people go their entire lives surrounded by noise, external and internal, never stopping long enough to ask, who am I beneath it all? Not the title, not the roles, not the version shaped by other people's expectations. Just you, unfiltered, unmasked, and unafraid to listen to the silence. We avoid solitude because it holds up a mirror, and we're not always ready to see what's staring back. We keep ourselves busy not because we're productive, but because we're terrified of stillness. Because in stillness, truth arrives, and the truth is rarely comfortable. But the Stoics knew that clarity is not born in conversation, it's born in contemplation. Marcus Aurelius didn't write Meditations in a crowd. He wrote it in silence, in solitude, in the company of his soul. That wasn't a weakness, it was discipline, it was courage, and it still speaks across centuries because it came from a place of honest solitude. Not noise, not pretense, not performance. In today's world, being alone is often seen as a problem to fix. Society tells you to stay connected, scroll endlessly, and fill every blank space with something. But if every moment is filled, when will you feel? If every second is noisy, how will you hear your own thoughts? Solitude isn't the problem. Escaping it is. You don't need more content, more opinions, or more validation. You need space, mental space, emotional space. It is a sacred space to breathe, reflect, and remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Stoic philosophy embraces solitude not as a retreat, but as a return. Return to your values, return to your clarity, return to your inner authority, the place that doesn't change with trends or moods. When you're alone, you stop performing. You stop seeking approval. You stop bending to be accepted. And that's when the real work begins. The inner conversation, the uncomfortable truths, the quiet realizations, and eventually, the peace. The kind of peace that can't be shaken because it wasn't given by anyone else. It came from within. Imagine this. A man sits on his porch every morning before the world wakes. No phone, no music, just coffee, silence, and the rising sun. It's the only moment in his day when nothing is expected of him, where he doesn't have to prove, please, or perform. That moment doesn't look like success from the outside. But inside, he's building something unbreakable. Presence, discipline, clarity. That's what solitude gives you when you stop fearing it and start practicing it. You don't need a retreat in the mountains to find yourself. You need 30 minutes of silence. You need to walk without headphones. You need nights without scrolling. You need to sit with your thoughts, not run from them. You need to make peace with your own presence. Because if you're not comfortable with yourself, you'll always need someone else to fill the silence. And when you depend on noise to feel alive, you lose your ability to hear your own wisdom. The Stoics trained in solitude because they understood that mastery of the self was the first and hardest victory. They weren't escaping the world. They were preparing to face it with calm minds, clear intentions, and unshakable values. That kind of strength isn't born from attention. It's born from awareness. And awareness grows in silence. You don't need to escape to find yourself. You need to stop escaping. When you sit in stillness long enough, the noise in your mind begins to settle, and what remains is the truth. So choose solitude, not as a punishment, but as practice. Practice being present with yourself. Practice listening before speaking. Practice existing without external input. Let it sharpen you, let it center you, let it humble and strengthen you at once. And in that space, stripped of the world's demands, you'll find what's essential. Not more, but less. Not louder, but deeper. Not someone else, but you. And once you know who that is, truly, you'll stop chasing what never mattered and start building from solid ground. Because the truth is, no one else can do that part for you. No one else can breathe your breath, think your thoughts, or live your path. That work belongs to you. And it begins the moment you stop running from yourself. You must walk your path alone, not in fear but in fullness. Not because you were abandoned, but because you were chosen for something deeper. That stillness is your doorway. Step through it, walk inward, and meet the man the world has been too loud to introduce you to. The real you. 2. You can't grow if you're always seeking approval. Every time you make a decision based on someone else's opinion, you move one step further from your true self. Growth doesn't happen under applause. It happens in silence, in discomfort, in choosing your path when no one's watching. Approval feels good, but it comes at a cost, and that cost is freedom. When your actions depend on likes, nods, or claps, you're not living. You're performing. You're trading your power for permission. Stoic philosophy calls that slavery of the mind, not because you're physically bound, but because your worth is chained to the reaction of others. There's a difference between being seen and being centered. One craves attention. The other cultivates direction. Epictetus taught that we must separate what is in our control from what is not. And the approval of others, that's never been in your hands. What you can control is your intention, your discipline, and your alignment with your values. When you need the world to agree with you in order to feel valid, you're giving away the steering wheel of your life. But when you anchor yourself in principle, quietly, firmly, you begin to grow from the inside out. A friend of mine was once caught in that loop. He built his career online, surrounded by noise, fueled by validation. Every post was calculated. Every project is tailored for likes. The audience grew, but something inside him didn't. He felt anxious when a video underperformed, restless when feedback was slow. Even his sense of identity began to blur. He was building numbers but losing himself. One day he stepped back. No announcements, no drama, just silence. He took time alone, stopped posting, and started asking questions he had avoided for years. What do I really want? What would I do if no one ever clapped? It was uncomfortable, it was quiet, but slowly he began to hear something that had long been drowned out, his own voice. That's what solitude gives you, the chance to stop performing and start becoming. You can't discover what truly matters to you when you're constantly shaped by what matters to everyone else. Real growth requires space. Space to fail, space to reflect, space to try without asking, will they approve? That's why Stoicism places so much weight on autarkic self-sufficiency. Not in material wealth, but in spirit. A mind that doesn't panic when judged, a heart that doesn't shrink when misunderstood, a soul that doesn't bend just to belong. When you chase approval, you start editing yourself. You say what's safe. You avoid conflict. You smile when you don't mean it. You say yes when your gut screams no. And the worst part? Over time, you forget which parts were you and which parts were curated to be liked. That kind of life is polished but hollow, outwardly stable, inwardly lost. A Stoic doesn't chase that. He builds a life so grounded in truth that rejection cannot shake it and praise cannot inflate it. That's freedom, not from others but from dependency on others. If you find yourself hesitating to speak your mind because you fear the response, stop. Ask yourself, am I choosing silence for peace or because I've been trained to avoid disapproval? If you're exhausted from trying to please everyone, pause. That exhaustion is a signal, not a weakness. It's your soul telling you it's time to return, to live by your standards, not theirs. When you anchor your worth internally, you stop being manipulated by the crowd. You stop overthinking every step. You walk, not to impress, but to express who you truly are. Real growth feels awkward. It feels quiet. It often goes unnoticed at first. But deep inside, it rewires how you think, how you choose, how you show up. You start to understand the difference between being liked and being respected, between being popular and being aligned. You stop chasing trends and start building principles. You stop asking, will they approve, and start asking, is this true to me? That shift changes everything. Your confidence stops rising and falling with metrics. Your decisions stop being emotional reactions. You gain clarity, focus, peace. Growth demands that you trust yourself, especially when others don't. It asks you to take paths where the crowd isn't cheering. It asks you to speak truths that won't go viral. It demands that you choose depth over applause. A Stoic understands this. He doesn't just talk about discipline, he lives it. In the quiet choices, in the unseen integrity, in the refusal to betray his values for validation. That's not cold. That's courageous. You will never feel fully free until you stop asking for permission to be yourself. You will never grow past your limitations while you're still shackled to the fear of disappointing others. And you will never walk your path alone until you first release the need to be followed. Let them misunderstand you. Let them question your silence. Let them think you've changed. You have. You've stopped living for them and started becoming you. 3. Silence is where strength is forged. Real strength isn't loud. It doesn't need attention. It doesn't beg to be seen. It's shaped in silence, in the spaces where no one is watching, where the crowd is gone, and you are left alone with your thoughts. That's where it begins. Not in chaos, not in applause, but in stillness. When there's nothing to distract you, nowhere to run, and no noise to mask the discomfort, that's when the real work starts. Because silence reveals. It strips away your defenses. It removes the excuses. It holds up the mirror you've been avoiding and demands that you look. The Stoics didn't seek noise. They didn't speak to be heard. They spoke when it mattered. They understood that discipline begins in the mind, and the mind cannot be disciplined by distraction. Strength, the kind that endures storms and setbacks, is forged in deliberate stillness. Not stillness as an escape, but stillness as preparation. When you sit with yourself in silence, you're not doing anything. You're doing the hardest thing imaginable. You're confronting the parts of you that perform, that avoid, that react. You're facing the fears that hide behind busyness. You're beginning to master the chaos within by refusing to escape it. We've been conditioned to associate silence with weakness. If you're not talking, you must not have anything to say. If you're not posting, you must be irrelevant. But that mindset is a trap. It pulls you into constant reaction, into noise for the sake of noise. Stoicism invites the opposite. It tells you to pause before you speak, think before you act, reflect before you judge. That restraint isn't passivity, it's power. A quiet mind can cut through lies. A calm presence can shift a room without saying a word. That kind of energy isn't created by accident. It's cultivated slowly in silence. Strength built in silence is different. It's not impulsive. It doesn't chase approval. It's rooted. It doesn't need to win every argument or prove a point. It speaks with purpose, and when it speaks, people listen. Because it carries something rare: clarity. In a world addicted to speed, silence slows you down just enough to choose wisely. It gives you the margin to respond, not react. It gives you the discipline to hold your ground when everything else tries to pull you off it. That is where calm becomes power. Stillness isn't absence, it's awareness, it's presence. It's knowing what matters and choosing not to waste energy on what doesn't. And that awareness doesn't show up by accident. It comes when you unplug. When you sit in silence, not out of boredom, but with intention. Let the mind wander, let the discomfort rise. Don't fight it, watch it. Observe what your mind does when no one's watching. That is the path to self-command. Because once you know how to be still, you cannot be shaken. The chaos outside no longer stirs the chaos inside. Stoic strength begins with observation. When you slow down enough to listen to your own thoughts, you begin to realize how much noise wasn't yours to begin with. How many fears were inherited? How many stories have you been telling yourself that no longer serve you? That's not a weakness. That's purification. That's you reclaiming the controls. And from that awareness, a new kind of authority emerges, quiet but unshakable. The kind that doesn't scream but speaks the truth. The kind that doesn't react but responds with intention. In silence, you begin to distinguish between impulse and wisdom, between reaction and principle. You learn to sit with frustration until it cools. You learn to wait before deciding. You learn that not every feeling deserves a response, and not every thought is a command. That space between what you feel and what you do, that is your power. And the only way to strengthen that space is to practice being still. Not once, not as a trend, but as a daily ritual. That's where the mind becomes strong. That's where inner peace becomes a skill, not just a mood. When you make silence part of your routine, something subtle shifts. Your decisions get cleaner, your words get sharper, your presence gets heavier. Not in a loud way, but in a grounded, calm, immovable way. You stop rushing, you stop justifying, you stop apologizing for your clarity. That in itself becomes a form of quiet leadership. You don't have to dominate the room. You just have to know who you are before you walk into it. So sit, turn down the volume. Listen not for noise, but for truth. Let silence teach you where your wounds are. Let it reveal what still needs work. Let it strip you down so you can rebuild, not as the person others expect, but as the person you were meant to become. The kind of person who walks into chaos with a still mind and walks out unchanged. That strength doesn't come from motivation. It doesn't come from hype. It comes from silence. And once you've forged it there, it stays with you everywhere. 4. Discomfort in solitude reveals what you still need to heal. If being alone makes you uneasy, that discomfort isn't your enemy, it's your teacher. It's not a weakness. It's not a failure. It's a signal pointing towards something inside you that still needs attention. We tend to silence that signal by drowning it in distractions, conversations we don't care about, content we don't need, noise that numbs us just enough to feel normal again. But avoidance is never a cure. The Stoics understood that pain is information. What you feel when you're alone isn't a punishment, it's a revelation. It's the whisper beneath the surface saying, look here, this part of you still hurts. Solitude strips away the filters. When the notifications stop, when the room quiets down, when the distractions are gone, all that remains is you, and the parts of you you've tried to bury. And that's the point. You can't heal what you don't acknowledge. You can't grow past what you keep avoiding. Real strength doesn't come from pretending you're fine. It comes from facing what you've spent years running from. The Stoic path is not a rejection of pain. It's a confrontation with it. Calmness doesn't come from pretending the storm isn't real. It comes from learning how to breathe through it without breaking. There's a man I once met who never spent a single evening alone. After work, he'd always meet friends, stay out late, or keep the TV running until he fell asleep. One night, everyone was busy. He sat in his apartment, alone for the first time in months. And within minutes, he started to feel this rising unease in his chest. Not because something was wrong, but because the quiet gave his emotions space to speak. Memories showed up he hadn't thought about in years. Questions surfaced he'd been ignoring. He felt the urge to call someone, to scroll, to open a drink, anything to shut it down. But instead he stayed, just sat there, uncomfortable but still, and something shifted. That night didn't fix everything, but it cracked the surface. It gave him a glimpse of what needed healing. Guilt, grief, shame. None of it is fatal. All of it is buried. And from that moment on, he stopped fearing solitude because he understood what it was really offering. That's what discomfort in solitude reveals, the unfinished business of the soul. Most people think peace means feeling good all the time. It doesn't. Peace means you're no longer afraid of your own mind, that even when the old wounds speak, you don't panic, you listen, you learn. You don't run, you sit with the tension and let it show you where to go. That's not easy. That's mastery. And mastery isn't loud. It's slow, quiet, earned one breath at a time. When you embrace solitude as a space for healing, you begin to transform your relationship with yourself. Instead of treating your inner discomfort like something to get rid of, you begin to see it as guidance. The anxiety, the restlessness, the itch to escape, they're not flaws, they're messages. Signals that part of your foundation needs reinforcement. And it's in the quiet, away from external validation, that you can finally hear what those signals are saying. You realize that stillness doesn't reveal weakness. It reveals what still makes you fragile. From that clarity, you start to rebuild from the inside out. Stoicism teaches that external events don't disturb us. It's our interpretation of them that does. And that interpretation is shaped by our inner landscape. If your mind is full of unhealed wounds, every silence becomes threatening. But when you tend to those wounds, silence becomes a sanctuary. It becomes the furnace where emotional resilience is forged. That's the shift. Solitude stops being something you fear and becomes something you value. It's not about escaping people. It's about facing yourself and finally realizing you were never broken, just buried under years of noise. So the next time you feel uncomfortable being alone, don't rush to fix it. Don't run to the nearest distraction. Stay with it. Observe it. Ask what it's trying to show you. Let the discomfort speak, not to shame you, but to guide you. You don't need to solve everything at that moment. You just need to stop silencing the signal. Let the stillness become your space for reflection, not avoidance. Because that's where healing begins. Not in escape, but in presence. Not in pretending to be strong, but in learning where your strength still needs to grow. Discomfort and solitude is not the problem. Denying it is. But when you face it with awareness and courage, you unlock a kind of calm that no one can take from you. A peace that's not built on silence, but born through it. A confidence that no longer depends on distractions to survive. And from that place, everything changes. You stop fearing your thoughts. You stop avoiding your past. You stop reacting to your pain. Instead, you learn to listen, to respond, to rise. Not as someone who never felt broken, but as someone who chose to heal in silence and on purpose. 5. Walking alone is how you find your direction, not someone else's. The path you were meant to walk rarely has a crowd on it. It's quiet. It's unclear at first. Most of the time it will ask you to choose direction over popularity. When you're constantly surrounded by opinions, noise, and the pace of everyone else's timeline, it becomes almost impossible to know if what you're pursuing is actually yours, or just something you were handed. True direction isn't borrowed, it's uncovered. And the only way to uncover it is by stepping away from the noise long enough to hear your own voice. Stoic philosophy doesn't glorify isolation. It honors clarity. Clarity never comes from imitation. You can live decades being efficient, successful, and even admired, while walking in a direction that was never meant for you. It happens quietly, gradually. You follow the signals of what's praised. You absorb expectations. You build your life like a checklist. And only when you stop, truly stop, do you realize the path you've walked was never yours. That's why solitude is essential, not for comfort, but for recalibration, for realignment, for honesty. You cannot find your personal compass by holding on to someone else's map. When you walk with the crowd, you keep their pace. You accept their priorities. You chase their definitions of progress. And slowly, your own becomes blurry. You start mistaking momentum for purpose. But speed doesn't mean direction. Movement doesn't mean meaning. Growth is only growth when it's going where your soul actually wants to go. The Stoics knew that being misunderstood was the cost of being free. That to walk inward often means walking away, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. When you finally choose to walk alone, it's not rebellion, it's remembrance. You're not rejecting the world, you're returning to yourself. You're saying, I'm ready to live with clarity, not conditioning. I'm ready to find out what I believe, not just what I've been told to believe. That choice will feel uncomfortable. It will challenge you. But that's where all meaningful growth begins, at the edge of comfort, beyond applause, and far from the approval of those who never dared to walk their own path. Walking alone gives you something the crowd never can: honest reflection. When no one's watching, your choices reveal your real values. Not the values you post about, not the ones you talk about, the ones you live. When you're alone, there's no one to impress, no one to compare to, no one to blame, just you and the truth. And that truth, while uncomfortable at first, is the foundation of every powerful life. You begin to ask better questions. Not what do they expect from me, but what matters to me. Not will this be accepted, but is this aligned? Not how do I win, but why am I chasing this at all? Those questions can't be answered in the noise. They need stillness. They need solitude. They need the courage to let go of what's familiar in exchange for what's authentic. That's the kind of strength Stoicism calls you toward. Not just control over emotion, but control over direction. Not just calmness under pressure, but conviction under confusion. And here's what most people won't tell you. Walking alone doesn't feel heroic. It feels uncertain, it feels slow, it feels like you're falling behind. But you're not. You're finally walking towards something real, something that won't disappear when the trend fades or the applause dies down. When you walk your own path, you're not chasing visibility, you're chasing vision. And vision doesn't need validation. It just needs integrity. It needs time. It needs consistency. You don't need to explain your choices to those who've never questioned theirs. The more you walk alone, the more you begin to recognize which desires are yours and which were inherited, which dreams were real and which were distractions. And that realization isn't loss, it's liberation. You get to start again, not from scratch, but from truth. And truth is always a solid place to build. Every step alone becomes a vote for your future. Every quiet decision becomes a deeper root. And one day, when the world finally sees what you've built, they'll call it strength. But you'll know it was solitude. You'll know it was stillness. You'll know it was alignment. So keep walking, even when no one joins, even when no one understands, especially then. Because your path was never meant to be popular, it was meant to be yours. And only when you walk alone long enough do you realize the silence wasn't empty. It was full of direction, waiting for you to listen. 6. Walking alone doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're becoming unshakable. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. One is a state of presence. The other is a state when you walk alone. It's not because you've been abandoned. It's because you've chosen clarity over comfort. It's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of self-possession, a mind that's grounded, a spirit that no longer needs permission to move. The Stoics understood this better than anyone. That solitude isn't exile, it's refinement. And those who embrace it are not retreating from life. They're preparing to meet it head-on, with a kind of stillness the world cannot shake. Strength is often misunderstood. We're taught to measure it by how many people follow you, how loudly you speak, and how visibly you succeed. But real strength doesn't advertise itself. It doesn't beg for recognition. It doesn't need witnesses. It grows in silence, alone, without applause. When you walk your path without a crowd, you're not proving something to others. You're proving something to yourself. That you can stand on your own 2 feet. That your values hold even when no one's validating them. That your choices don't waver under pressure. That is the foundation of being unshakable. You don't become grounded by clinging to people. You become grounded by knowing who you are without them. And that's what walking alone offers. A direct confrontation with your own core. Without someone else's energy to lean on, you begin to cultivate your own. You don't ask, who will catch me? You ask, can I carry myself? And when the answer is yes, something irreversible happens. You stop chasing stability outside and start building it within. That shift is quiet, but it changes everything. Walking alone forces you to face discomfort without flinching. It teaches you to observe your emotions without reacting to them, to respond with intention instead of impulse. You begin to recognize the spaces where you've depended on others for confidence, clarity, and worth. And in that recognition, you start to reclaim each one. That's not abandonment. That's ownership. That's taking responsibility for your mind, your peace, and your pace. And nothing builds confidence like knowing that, even on your worst days, you won't collapse just because no one is holding your hand. A Stoic doesn't fear silence or separation. He leans into them, because he knows that in the absence of noise, the mind speaks more clearly. In the absence of affirmation, the soul becomes its own compass. Strength isn't about appearing strong. It's about being centered when the storm comes. Not because you're above it, but because you've trained in the calm before it. You've walked alone enough times to know the terrain, and you no longer fear losing what you've never depended on. So much of modern life is built on external reinforcement. Metrics, feedback, social signals. You post, you wait, you watch, you move, you check, you compare. And the moment that attention slows, your confidence dips. That cycle is not strength, it's dependency in disguise. But when you learn to walk without that loop, when you build a life where your choices are driven by principle, not pressure, you become untouchable. Not because you don't feel, but because you don't sway. You're not moved by trends, you're not broken by judgment, you're not inflated by applause. You simply remain. There is power in stillness, not passive stillness, but practiced stillness. The kind forged by discipline, the kind tested in silence, the kind refined by solitude. That's what separates those who react from those who lead. It's not charisma, it's control. And that control is born in the quiet hours where no one sees the choices you make, but you make them anyway, with integrity. Every time you choose stillness over reaction, alignment over acceptance, or solitude over dependence, you reinforce the kind of inner strength that lasts. Walking alone doesn't mean you're lost. It means you've found, not by someone else, by yourself. It means you no longer fear the silence. You trust it. You use it. You let it shape you, not into someone hard, but someone anchored. And that anchoring isn't cold, it's compassionate, because once you stop needing others to hold you together, you can finally show up whole. For them, for life, for whatever comes next. You don't have to be the loudest voice in the room, you just need to be the most stable one. And that stability doesn't come from followers, it comes from a foundation, built in the unseen moments, the hard moments, the solitary moments. When you chose to keep walking, not because someone asked you to, but because you knew this was the way forward. Not loud, not easy, but true. So if the road feels quiet, keep walking. If it feels unfamiliar, stay the course. You're not off track, you're off script. And that's exactly where you're meant to be, becoming someone the world can't move because you've already made peace with walking alone. 7. You must know who you are before you can love or lead anyone else. Before you can guide someone else, you have to stop wandering in your own mind. Before you can love with clarity, you must first sit with your own shadows. No relationship, romantic, parental, or professional, can thrive when built on an unstable foundation. And the most unstable foundation is an unknown self. You cannot offer peace if you are driven by your own chaos. You cannot lead if you're constantly doubting your direction. That's why the deepest act of love isn't what you give to others. It's what you first uncover in yourself. We spend so much time learning how to connect, how to impress, and how to communicate. But none of it matters if you don't know the person behind the words. If your thoughts are a blur, if your values shift with every conversation, if your decisions are shaped by external validation, then what are you really offering the people around you? The Stoics understood this. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, but he wrote privately every night, not about conquest, but about self-mastery. He knew leadership begins in solitude, that if you can't command your own mind, you have no business commanding anyone else's trust. Love, too, is misunderstood. Most people think it's about how much you can give. But real love starts with how well you understand what you're giving. If you've never confronted your wounds, you'll love from a place of fear. If you've never owned your flaws, you'll seek completion through someone else's attention. And if you haven't built inner clarity, you'll project confusion onto every connection you touch. The path to deep, stoic love isn't paved with affection. It's paved with responsibility. Not for others, but for yourself. Knowing yourself isn't a luxury, it's a duty, especially if you want to lead, guide, protect, or inspire. A man who hasn't sat with his doubts will spread them to others. A man who hasn't owned his pain will pass it on. That's why silence is necessary. That's why solitude matters, because it's in those still moments, away from the noise, that you finally meet the parts of yourself you've neglected. The fears you've disguised as ambition, the insecurities you've masked with charm, the unresolved grief you've buried under busyness. Once you see them clearly, you stop leading from your ego. You start leading from presence. It doesn't mean you'll be perfect. It means you'll be honest about where you stand, about what you carry, and that honesty becomes your strength. People don't need you to be flawless. They need you to be anchored. And you can't anchor anyone else if you're still drifting. That's why the Stoic path isn't self-centered. It's self-aligned. And from alignment comes integrity. From integrity comes leadership. From leadership comes impact. Not because you pushed harder, but because you became more still, more focused, more true. When you begin to know yourself deeply, something shifts. Your love becomes less needy and more generous. Your advice becomes less reactive and more reflective. Your presence no longer demands attention, it offers calm. You no longer seek to impress, you aim to understand. And in that shift, people begin to trust you. Not because you say the right things, but because you live them. Not because you're always certain, but because you're not afraid to be silent until clarity comes. That's what makes you unshakable in relationships. Not how much you do, but how deeply you see yourself in others. You can sit with someone else's storm because you've learned to sit through your own. You can hold space for someone else's confusion because you've made peace with your own. That kind of strength can't be faked. It can't be rushed. It's the result of choosing reflection over reaction, silence over noise, and solitude over performance. So if you want to live well, lead well, and live well, start where it's hardest. Start by sitting with yourself, not for a moment, but until the noise fades, until the masks drop, until what remains is something solid, something sincere. Then bring that self to the world. Bring that clarity to your relationships, that honesty to your leadership, that depth to your decisions, because that's where your power begins, not in how well you perform for others, but in how well you understand yourself when no one's watching. You don't need to be perfect to love or to lead, but you need to be real. You need to be willing to face the parts of you that are still uncertain, still healing, still learning. And that courage, the courage to meet yourself without judgment, is what transforms you from someone who seeks direction to someone who gives it. From someone who reaches for love to someone who radiates it. Know yourself, completely, uncomfortably, relentlessly. Because everything you want to build, every person you hope to impact, starts with the person you see in silence. And the moment that reflection becomes clear, so will the path forward. 8. Alone time is sacred. It's where you recharge your soul. There's a kind of silence that doesn't just quiet the world, it reawakens you, a stillness that doesn't feel empty, but full. Full of clarity, full of breath, full of answers that only come when the noise dies down. Time alone isn't something to squeeze between obligations. It's not a luxury or a last resort. It's sacred. It's where you pause the external race and reconnect with your internal compass. It's not about isolation, it's about restoration, about unplugging from expectation and plugging back into purpose. In a world that glorifies productivity and constant motion, stillness feels rebellious. But it is in that very rebellion where the Stoic finds his power. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire, yet his deepest insights weren't forged in meetings or speeches. They came in the quiet hours of reflection when he stepped back from the chaos and into the quiet. That's the invitation. Alone time is not where you lose your edge, it's where you sharpen it. It's where you check your alignment. Ask yourself the questions that matter. Am I living from conviction or momentum? Am I acting on truth or reaction? Do I still recognize the man I'm becoming? You don't need a retreat to do this. You need a morning without distractions, a walk without your phone, a chair by the window where the only agenda is to sit and breathe. Those moments are not wasted. They are fuel. They are where your internal systems recalibrate, where your emotional discipline is restored, where your energy, often drained by the noise of the world, slowly refills. That's not slowness. That's strength. The Stoics weren't escapists. They were realists. They understood that a man who cannot retreat within will eventually collapse without. They didn't seek escape from responsibility. They sought solitude to meet it better prepared. Alone time isn't an excuse to disconnect. It's the preparation to reconnect with purpose, with presence, with people. You become someone who walks into a room with calm in your chest because you've earned it in the quiet. There's a kind of fatigue that no sleep can fix, the kind that comes from emotional clutter, from mental overstimulation, from always reacting, never resetting. That's the fatigue solitude cures. Not by solving problems, but by making space for solutions to appear. You sit with your discomfort instead of scrolling past it. You face your fears instead of drowning them in noise. You learn to be still, not because everything is okay, but because that stillness itself begins to make things okay. In solitude, you remember what you value. You question what you've accepted. You notice what feels off. And in that noticing, you begin to reclaim what the world slowly steals without your awareness, your attention, your focus, your truth. This is not a ritual for the weak. It's for those who want to live with intention, And like any discipline, it demands consistency. You can't recharge your soul with chaos. You recharge it with conscious, deliberate space, untouched by performance. Every time you return to yourself, you return stronger. Not louder, not more reactive, just more rooted. You don't need to prove it. You don't need to defend. You simply move from clarity. You listen deeper. You see sharper. Because you are no longer scattered across obligations. You are centered, and people feel that. They feel your peace. They feel your presence. Not because you announced it, but because you practiced it. In your alone time, you make decisions that aren't swayed by fear. You reconnect to your reason, your logos, that quiet Stoic compass that points not to what's popular, but to what's right. The longer you sit with yourself, the more you realize that most of what stressed you wasn't urgent. Most of what angered you wasn't personal. Most of what confused you needed only space to sort itself out. And now you've given it that space. Don't let the world rush you out of that sacred rhythm. Protect it. Treat it like oxygen, like water, like sunlight. When you abandon your alone time, you start running on fumes. You start performing rather than living. You become reactive rather than resilient. But when you guard it like the Stoics did, with quiet strength and non-negotiable presence, you become unshakable. Calm isn't something you wait for. It's something you cultivate. So give yourself that hour, that morning, that slow cup of coffee, that walk at dusk. Don't fill it. Let it be empty enough to listen, to feel. Ask yourself the only questions that truly matter. Am I still on my path? Am I still me? And if the answer is unclear, stay. Stay until it is. That's the real power of solitude. Not to distract you from life, but to return you to it, with fire in your lungs and direction in your eyes. You were never meant to follow the noise. You were meant to walk your own path with quiet conviction. What you've just heard is not simply philosophy. It's a practice, a way of living with intention, clarity, and strength. The Stoics taught us that solitude is not a void, but a mirror. That silence is not a weakness, but a weapon. And that walking alone is not a punishment, but a preparation. In solitude, you meet the self you've avoided. You stop performing. You start listening. You ask the hard questions. Am I living in alignment? Am I acting with purpose? And in the stillness, you begin to answer. With honesty, with courage, with resilience. Walking alone doesn't make you distant. It makes you defined. It's where your character sharpens, your values solidify, your inner peace becomes unshakable. You stop needing approval, you stop chasing applause, and you begin to rise from within. So, take what you've learned here and live it. Not just once, but daily. Protect your alone time. Welcome silence. Practice self-reflection. Build your emotional discipline like a muscle. Let solitude train your focus, guide your integrity, and anchor your spirit. This is your path. Walk it slowly. Walk it boldly. Walk it honestly. Because the man who knows himself, who chooses silence over noise, who walks with presence instead of pressure, that man cannot be moved. And now I invite you to share your journey. In the comments below, write what solitude has taught you, or where you hope it might lead. Your story might just be the light someone else is looking for. Let this not be the end of a video, but the beginning of a deeper, quieter, stronger life. One that only you can build. One step at a time, in silence.